In this video, I'll provide an overview of our discussion board 10 this week, along with our Part 3 Inferential Statistics for our research project. So here we are on our homepage, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the weekly modules like we usually do. And then scrolling down, again, you can see I have the Airbnb research project module, which has all our components. So the focus of this video is the Part 3 Inferential Statistics assignment. So the video you're watching right now is this link right here. You also have the typical resources, so worksheets, the videos under Chapter 10. Here's the discussion board. Here's the Part 3 business memo on inferential statistics that you'll submit on Sunday, and then the quiz and homework like usual. So I'm going to go ahead and click on to the discussion board 10. Now recall that the purpose of the discussion boards is to help you not procrastinate on your project. It breaks up the project into pieces. So it's really important that you do this because this allows you to get feedback from your peers before you have to put it into your Part 3 Inferential Statistics business memo. And then I give you feedback on that. And then that way you can put the best version of your hypothesis test into the final presentation at the end of the semester. So in last week's discussion board, you had to develop a hypothesis test, either of a mean or a proportion. So in this week's discussion board, you're going to run the hypothesis test now. So if you did a hypothesis test of a mean, that's an average, or you might have done a hypothesis test of a proportion. So I've created a worksheet to guide you through this process. So I'll go ahead and click and open that up. So you can see on the top half of the worksheet is the instructions on how to do a hypothesis test for a population mean. It's fill in the blank to make sure that you have every piece of information that you need in order to conduct the hypothesis test. You'll notice in Part A, I have 3 different decision rules available, and this will depend on how you set up your null and alternative hypotheses. So recall that if your null is equal to and your alternative is not equal to, you're going to be doing a two-tailed test. So then you would use this first decision rule up here. And I give you the formula on how to find the critical t-value for your decision rule. If your hypothesis test has an alternative statement that is less than, then you want to use the lower tail decision rule here. And again, I give you the critical t-value in Excel to find your t-values for the decision rule. If you are doing an alternative statement that has a greater than symbol, then you're doing an upper tail test, and you'll want to use this third statement here for your decision rule. And again, I have the critical t-value formula in Excel that you'll use to find your critical t-value for the decision rule. You will not use all 3 decision rules. You'll only use the one that applies to your null and alternative hypothesis setup. So in Part B, we have the test statistic formula. So you'll plug in all the information from up here into the formula and solve to get your test statistic. And then in Part C and D, these are the 2 approaches to make your decision, the critical value approach and the p-value approach. So then you can apply your learning to make the right decision. I recommend doing both because they should match. If for some reason your results in Part C does not match what's in Part D, in terms of whether or not you reject or not reject the null, then you know you've made an error somewhere, and I would recommend going back and double checking. So if we scroll down, here is the instructions on how to do a hypothesis test for a population proportion. And so it's really important you know the difference between a mean and a proportion, otherwise you might use the wrong set of instructions on this worksheet. Means are averages, and averages come from numeric values, whereas proportions come from categorical variables, so words. So any variable in our Airbnb data that had words in it, like property type or cancellation policy, you can use a hypothesis test for a proportion. And again, it walks you through the steps. It has the pieces that apply to proportions. And again, in Part A, I have the 3 decision rules. You'll pick the one that applies to the way you set up your null and alternative hypothesis. Here's the formula for the test statistic in Part B. So you want to plug in all of the variables in the right place and solve for it. And then again in Part C and D, your 2 approaches, critical value approach and the p-value approach. So I do recommend doing both approaches to make sure they are consistent with each other. Note, under the p-value approach, I have the formulas to find the p-values depending on what kind of test you have, two-tailed, lower, or upper. So going back to the discussion board, I have my examples here for a hypothesis test of a mean and a hypothesis test of a proportion. And you'll see that I've got a video link under each example that walks you through how to calculate or conduct your hypothesis test. And then below is actually how we would write or explain the hypothesis test results. So here's the results of my hypothesis test of a mean. I conducted a hypothesis test on the average price per night in the neighborhood called Villa Marie of Montreal, because I'm thinking of opening a bike and wine beer tour. So here's my null and alternative hypotheses. My population mean is equal to 120, or my population mean is not equal to 120 per night. And then I'll provide my variables here. It says the alpha level for my hypothesis test is 0.05. My hypothesized population mean was 120, and that came from a travel budget Montreal website. So recall that your hypothesized values come from outside sources. They cannot come from the Airbnb data directly. My sample size was 1,503 listings. My sample mean that I calculated was $109.32, and the sample standard deviation was $259.84. And then using Excel, I found critical t-values at plus or minus 1.96 based on a degrees of freedom of 1502. So when I plugged all these variables in, my calculated test statistic based on this data is negative 1.59. And then I'm using the critical value approach because the test statistic of negative 1.59 is not less than my critical value of negative 1.96. We do not reject the null, which means the average price per night is $120 in Villa Marie. And that means that this neighborhood is upscale enough and I should open my bike and wine beer tour business here. So it's really important to have these variables here because this is going to allow a reader, whether it's your peer or me, to verify your hypothesis test. Without this information, we don't know if you conducted it correctly and you won't get full credit for the assignment. Scrolling down, here's my hypothesis test for a proportion. Again, I've got the video that walks you through how to conduct the hypothesis test, but my write-up would say that I did a hypothesis test on the proportion of listings in Villa Marie that are apartments, again for my business. So here is my null and alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is that the proportion of apartments in Villa Marie is going to be greater than 0.8 or 80%. And my null is just everything else. So that's the proportion is going to be less than or equal to 0.8. So again, I have all my details here so that a reader can verify my calculations. But my alpha level is 0.05. My hypothesized population proportion is the 0.8. And in a previous video, I had originally had it at 0.5, which is a conservative number. But after thinking about it, I am modifying it to 0.8, which is a greater majority of apartments because that would imply or suggest that it's a densely populated urban area with a lot of apartments. So my sample size is 1,149 listings, and the sample proportion was 0.93 based on 1,069 apartments out of the listings. I used the Appendix F, or I used Excel to find my critical z-value. And again, this is only one tail test because it's a greater than statement, so my critical z-value is positive. And then plugging everything in, I get a test statistic of 11.05 using the variables right here. So my conclusion is based off of the critical value method. Based on our test statistic of 11.05, since it's greater than my critical value of 1.645, we will reject the null, which means that our proportion of apartments is greater than 0.8 or 80% in Villa Marie. And that means my neighborhood is densely populated and would be a good location for my bike and wine business tour because that means there'll be a lot of people passing by my business. In terms of your peer post, I'd like you to analyze and comment on a peer post. So some of the past peer posts, while they've been quite positive, are not necessarily giving constructive feedback. So here is your chance. you should be practicing your knowledge of hypothesis testing by taking the variables that you see in your peers' post and actually conducting the hypothesis test. So calculate the test statistic, find the critical value, compare the two numbers, and then see did they do it correctly. If you see an error, help them by offering the correction. If it's correct, tell them it's correct. You're welcome to comment on more than one peer post. Try to post to someone who hasn't received a peer response yet. As an incentive to practice checking hypothesis test results, if you find an error in someone's calculations and correct it, I will offer 5 extra credit points. I will be verifying everyone's hypothesis test based on the Part 3 business memo that has this information in it. But the discussion board is primarily for you to practice it and share it with your peers, and so your peers can give feedback. And then you just copy paste it into your Part 3. So let's go ahead and look at the Part 3 business memo. So I'm going to click here onto the Part 3 Inferential Statistics. And so it's a 1 to 2 page single-space business memo. The first component of the assignment is to provide your confidence interval estimates for a variable of interest and explain why it is useful to a decision maker. You already did this in a previous discussion board, and I also provided feedback on it. So as long as it's correct, you can just copy paste that and put it right into your Part 3 business memo. And then Part 2, this is where you're going to explain the developed hypothesis test and why it's useful. So you already did this too. This was back in discussion board 9. And then articulate your finding. This is where you provide the calculations of your hypothesis test and the conclusions. So this came from your discussion board 10. So make sure to include all of the components in your hypothesis test, just like in your discussion board, which is what were your null and alternative hypotheses, the alpha level, sample size, the mean or proportions that you used, and any applicable variables like the sample standard deviation. So that's what you're working on in discussion board 10. So you'll just copy and paste that into this Part 3. Make sure these components are in here. I'm going to use the variables in order to rerun your hypothesis test to see if you did it correctly. That way I can assess your learning, help you fix it for the final presentation, but also make sure that you know how to do a hypothesis test, which is part of your learning in this class. And the last piece is the so what. So what are the business implications of your findings? Again, you write about this in your discussion board 10, and you'll just include it here in your assignment. So as you can see, everything in this assignment you are already doing in one of the discussion boards. You just have to put it together in a Word doc so that I can now provide feedback and evaluate it properly for the assignment. Again, I do include the different resources like the worksheet and the videos, again, in case you need to find it somewhere. And I have a template for a business memo that you can use. And then if we click right here, you can actually see examples of Part 3 Inferential Statistics. I have 3, Portland, South Africa, and Sydney, that you can see from previous classes. Again, they're not perfect assignments, but they're good. They're like A-level assignments. So you can see how you can model yours similarly, but you want to make sure to follow the instructions on the assignment as your checklist. So if you have any questions, just let me know.